All right. Hi, everyone. So it's Thursday for you, but it's Thursday and Friday for me because this is going to be the last of these little fireside chats, to quote Franklin Roosevelt, that I'm going to be doing this week. So I'll be back on Monday. But what I wanted to do today is to talk a little bit about the primary source that you've got for today, as we're talking about America's experience in the Second World War, and then I'm also going to talk some about what I have in mind for the readings and the assignment for tomorrow, which then leads into a shorter essay that's due on Sunday. And then I'm going to preview just a couple of things about what's going to be coming on Monday. So we've got basically 3 days of things that I'm going to talk about, but I'm not going to talk about any of them all that much. I think that you're probably pretty well set at this point. So the primary source that you can see, and some of you have already written about in the forums for today, is from a Supreme Court case. It's a famous Korematsu case, in which the Supreme Court ruled that it was acceptable for the United States government to move 120,000 Japanese Americans onto detention centers, which were at the time called concentration camps. Obviously, the meaning of that has changed since then, and they're not usually referred to as the same thing, but they were at the time called concentration camps. So let's just think a little bit about this as a source. And here's especially what I want you to kind of keep in mind as you're looking through this, to anticipate this. In the middle of early next week, one of the sources that you'll be looking at are congressional debates surrounding a major piece of legislation. And I'd like you to kind of consider the similarities and the differences and the advantages and the disadvantages when you're looking at government sources to construct a history between a legislative type of source, as when you see Congress debating a bill, which we'll see next week, versus a different branch of government, in this case, the Supreme Court, doing its work. So what are some of the strengths and the weaknesses and the advantages and disadvantages of different branches of government considering different problems? There are a couple of things with the Supreme Court case that are appealing, and a few things that are just challenges that are worth keeping in mind. I think one of the things that makes Supreme Court cases really interesting to all historians, or to anyone who's interested in the history of the United States, really, is that every time the Supreme Court hears a case, that case started at a much lower level. It's been appealed through a series of courts to reach the high court. And whatever initial court heard that case, it would have heard it in a very local context. In other words, although the Supreme Court is an exalted federal branch of the government, the cases that it is hearing are often involving people, ordinary people, often. So one of the things that we can get from Supreme Court cases is, because the case has to be so thoroughly detailed by all of the lawyers involved, we can wind up learning an awful lot about the specific instance that led to the case itself, and a lot of background about the people who are often just ordinary American people who become involved in some sort of legal dispute that winds up winding its way through the court system that the Supreme Court ultimately decides that it wants to hear. So it's a good way of getting a bit of a social history from it. But the other thing that the Supreme Court does, it's rooted in the social history, the lived experience of ordinary people, but it is then accepted by the Supreme Court because the court believes that it will have broad political and intellectual implications for the way that the Constitution is interpreted and enforced. In other words, there's usually a key question of the Constitution, the charter, the ultimate document of the American government, the ultimate sort of baseline of defining what American freedom is, that the court says, okay, this is a question that we need to answer in relation to that. So on the one hand, you have a picture of social life that's nicely detailed in a lot of Supreme Court cases. And on the other hand, you have some of the best minds in the country wrestling with very abstract questions of justice and democracy and these types of things. So for both of those reasons, Supreme Court deliberations are interesting. If you're going to have maybe a downside to looking at a Supreme Court case, let's think about the Korematsu case, for instance. Probably the downside, or I guess I wouldn't call it a weakness per se, but something to keep in mind as you're reading a Supreme Court case is it's operating according to self-constructed rules of reasoning, right? In other words, it's the legal universe that the Supreme Court operates in. So it's operating on the basis of precedent. It's a precedent probably more than anything else. And so if you don't know the precedents involved, you can be a little bit lost in looking at some Supreme Court cases. And so I just want to sort of highlight, it is important to get your head around this Hayashi case that's referenced in the Korematsu case, because that Hayashi case was a precedent. That's why it's given so much weight in the Korematsu deliberations. And again, that's maybe obvious, but if we're not thinking the way the lawyers would think or that judges would think in terms of having precedent as being so important, it might not seem clear why that issue keeps coming up all the time. The last thing that I'll mention about the Korematsu case is just to think about, how does the majority come to its conclusion? And what is it that the majority actually rules? I think that you would have to read this majority decision as an almost painfully narrow ruling. The majority opinion goes to great lengths to try to say, we are not talking about race. We are not making a judgment on whether or not the government can target people because of race. Essentially, what the majority is saying, we are just looking at the very, very narrow particulars of the question of whether Korematsu violated this particular ordinance, and we find that he did. Therefore, we're ruling against him. Is that a cop-out? Do you think that the majority, in making that ruling, is it even legally justifiable, do you think? Or would you say, okay, I see what the majority is saying, it's a legally acceptable argument, but it misses other important things? The other important thing to keep in mind is that once it's decided, Korematsu itself becomes a precedent. And this is not an idle point, because in the wake of 9/11, for instance, there were Justice Department lawyers who were reviewing the Korematsu case, wondering whether or not it was a precedent for interning Arab Americans in the wake of September 11th. So for a court to make a decision and then set a precedent is a really big deal. One of the few times that we've seen in modern American history a precedent really overturned in a significant ways will be coming up in the Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954. That was a reversal of Plessy v. Ferguson. But those kinds of precedent reversals of that scale are pretty rare in Supreme Court history. So what does it mean for the court to set a precedent on something that is that important on such narrow grounds? That would be something for you that you might want to ponder as you're reading the sources. Okay, so let me just talk a little bit about what you'll be looking at tomorrow, and then just a couple of words about Monday. But mostly I want to talk a little bit about tomorrow, since I'm not going to appear here. So there's no she reading for tomorrow. There's no podcast that I have because I couldn't find a good one. There's no video, because I couldn't find a good one. So in terms of the variety of stuff, all that you're doing tomorrow is you're reading the sources that are posted on Moodle. Now you'll see 5 sources there, but don't freak out because 4 of them are really short. In fact, 2 of them are basically a page long, and the other 2 are maybe 2 of those other 4 are maybe 4 to 5 pages. The only one that's kind of long is the link to the book by Samuel Moyn called The Last Utopia. And I'm asking you to read a chapter of that book. So you've got a chapter of a book and then a handful of short sources. I just want to explain what those sources are, what you can expect to be seeing, and why I'm assigning it, what I'm doing. So World War II is important in and of itself for all sorts of reasons. But there's the war, and then there's the immediate aftermath of the war. Obviously, those are related, but in a way, they're both so big and so important that I wanted to spend one day today just thinking about the war years themselves and the impact of the war years, and then another day tomorrow thinking about the immediate outcome of World War II. And I will be my cards fully on the table here. Historians are not supposed to be what are called presentists. Those are fighting words. If you're at a history conference and you call another historian to be engaging in presentism, meaning you're thinking about the present and you're not viewing the past on its own terms. But I'm thinking a lot about the international order that was created at the end of World War II, because we live we might be living through the death throes of that order right now. Our current president does not seem to value NATO. England might be abandoning the European Union. Illiberal governments are in Poland and Hungary. It's a very uncertain moment, and all of the pressure points are on the international order that arose at the end of World War II, that was designed to create a system of multilateral American-led institutions that were designed to support free markets, global trade, and some modicum of a version of liberal democracy. So if that order is indeed imperiled right now, that's a big deal. And I think just as a matter of living through the moments that we're living in, I want you to spend a few moments reflecting on what that order was when it was put together. Why was it put together? What were the lessons that the people who were designing that order were taking from the 1920s, 30s, and 40s to design it in the first place? And if that order is imperiled, what do you think is likely to replace it? Particularly in thinking about the values that were articulated by the people who designed that order. What values will replace the values that were articulated in the post-World War II international order? So anyway, I believe that it's a matter of key contemporary cultural, political literacy to be thinking about the outcome of the Second World War. So the particular documents I'm asking you to look at, there are three primary sources. The first one is referred to as the Atlantic Charter. It's very, very short. The Atlantic Charter was basically a statement of principles that was created at the first meeting of Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill in 1941. It's pretty shocking that as early as 1941, at a time when the United States is not even a combatant in World War II, they are envisioning a post-war world. But the reason that this was so important for everybody involved is because everybody knew that the reason that the world was exploding in the late 30s and early 40s, the reason that the world was about to go through hell again, was because the post-war order had failed after World War I, that World War I had not created a stable post-war environment, and that they were now reaping the whirlwind of that in the late 30s and early 40s. And Roosevelt was a reluctant internationalist, but he had become won over to internationalism. He'd become won over to the idea that the United States had to play a leading role in the world with partners. And in doing so, it needed to clearly establish what vision American leadership was to play in creating a particular type of world. And so here they are in 1941 already saying, okay, when the war is over, they're pretty ambitious already in 1941, thinking that they would win the war. There was good reason to think that they wouldn't at least win outright. Really not until 1944 is that starting to become clear. But nevertheless, they're saying, okay, when the war ends, what should the world look like? What principles should structure the world after fascism is defeated, after militarism is defeated? What will the world look like? And it lays out a certain set of principles. What's interesting about these principles is how closely they parallel what Roosevelt is saying about the New Deal in the United States. Roosevelt gives a famous speech in which he outlines what he calls the four freedoms. In other words, the four key ideals of freedom that the United States is going to defend in World War II. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and freedom of religion, of course, is an old freedom that America is supporting. But in the context of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, this notion of freedom of religion takes on a definitely an added weight. Freedom of speech and of religion, freedom from want, in other words, economic security, as we talked about yesterday, social security, and freedom from fear. In other words, freedom from the fear of tyranny, the fear of oppression, the fear of persecution. So two traditionally liberal, 18th century liberal freedoms from the government, so that you have freedom of religion and freedom of speech, and then freedoms that the government provides you, security and economic security and national security. That's what Roosevelt is saying for Americans. And in the Atlantic Charter, what's interesting is that he's proposing a version that is sort of an international version of the four freedoms. That's the first document. The second document is from an address to Congress that Roosevelt gives in 1944. This is the only of the three sources. This is the only one that is not specifically an international source, but I wanted you to take a look at it. It's only a page. It's an address to Congress, and it's generally Roosevelt referred to it as the Second Bill of Rights. It is sometimes referred to as the Economic Bill of Rights. And again, we have to go back to say, what does Roosevelt see the post-war world doing? In 1944, America's been at war for almost 3 years. Hundreds of thousands of people have died. The entire country has been mobilized. The entire economy has been mobilized to the end of winning the war. Roosevelt wants to lay out essentially what has it been for, what is the purpose of it, and what he wants to do is kind of to remind people of what he had been promising with the New Deal in the 30s. And part of what he had been promising was freedom from want and freedom from fear. And so looking towards the end of the war, Roosevelt wants to, again, reinforce the notion that we rethink our definition of freedoms, that we have not just a first Bill of Rights, but a second Bill of Rights. The first Bill of Rights was all individual freedoms. The second Bill of Rights is social security, economic security. So think about the way that he is proposing using the legacy of World War II as a way of making the New Deal a permanent alteration in American policy, and that he then sees America as a sort of as a mirror of what other nations should do. And then the third source, the third primary source that you're looking at is the United Nations, a famous document from the United Nations, the UN Declaration of Human Rights. So the United Nations is basically a revamped version of the League of Nations, which had failed after the United States failed to join it in at the end of World War I. Well, the United States doesn't make the same mistake twice. The United States eagerly embraces the United Nations and, in fact, takes a leadership position in the United Nations. The United Nations famously meets in San Francisco in 1945 and led by Eleanor Roosevelt, wife of Franklin Roosevelt, who by this time has died. Eleanor Roosevelt leads an international delegation of composing a multilateral document that is going to be a statement of principles to define what will the multilateral American-led post-war UN order look like. What will be the values that will govern this world? And they say that the primary principle that will lead the world forward is this concept of human rights. Now, there, of course, have been various iterations of notions of rights and human rights before, but the actual phrase human rights as a universal international set of principles had never really been articulated this way. And even more so, the idea was that the United Nations was going to be a sort of a governing body. So it's proposing human rights as a universal applicable to any person, anywhere, set of principles that is going to be enforced by international law. That's something that is new. So consider America's role in kind of creating this sort of template of a sort of New Deal for the world and a New Deal for America in the post-war world, and how that influences the development of this idea of human rights. Okay, those are the first three primary sources. They're all pretty short. Then I'm asking you to read two secondary sources. One by a historian who is looking specifically at the Atlantic Charter, which you will have read, and the other, a historian who's looking at the development of human rights in the United Nations, which you also will have read, the UN Declaration of Human Rights. What's interesting is that these two historians more or less disagree. One is much more optimistic about the impact and the legacy that this humanitarian thought had, that it was more immediate and wide-ranging and transformational. The other historian is fairly pessimistic, doesn't see human rights doing very much, actually comes to see it, at least in the 1940s, as something that nobody cared that much about, and was quickly sort of co-opted by conservatives to fight the Cold War, and didn't really become a sort of broadly resounding rallying cry until the 1970s. So I want you to consider both of those interpretations of the legacy of human rights. Again, consider the legacy, because that legacy is up for grabs right now. So let's have some historical perspective about it. Okay, looking forward to Monday. Last thing, just a couple of things about Mondays. First of all, I have added, we'll be talking about the Cold War, the development of the Cold War on Monday, and I have added another link to one of those crash course videos. If you watched it and enjoyed it, got something out of it for World War II, it's again optional, but talking about the Cold War, there's a lot going on, and if you're not very familiar with it, I'd recommend watching this 14-minute video just to get a big overview before you go into the reading. So you'll have the option of looking at that crash course video. The other thing to note is that the film for Monday is on Netflix. I know that one person doesn't have a Netflix subscription. I'm sorry about that. This is the only piece of media that I was not able to get that is absolutely free. You can rent this episode if you don't have Netflix for $1.99 on YouTube. This is Oliver Stone's Untold History of the United States, episode 6 on JFK, and in particular on the Cuban Missile Crisis, which will be at the center of the sources that we're talking about on Monday. Okay, so if you have any questions about any of that, let me know. I'll, of course, be checking in. I'm starting to respond to forum posts. I'm going to be a little more active in just posting some feedbacks to your forums. Looks like the conversations so far, particularly in the news conversations, have been really good. So keep it up. And I will be in touch over the weekend, and we'll have one more week to go. All right, thanks. Bye-bye.